Hello, and welcome to the second of the study units looking at strategy and the responsibilities of a firm. Now, in the last study unit, we began to look at how strategy needs to take account of the interests of the stakeholders within the firm. And we introduced the long-running debate between the shareholder model of the responsibilities of the firm and the stakeholder model. We saw how in the shareholder model, the owners, the investors in a firm should take priority in the firm's interests. And society is seen as benefiting as through that focus, the firm generates more economic value. And from that is able to pay more taxes that allows government and individuals to focus on the wider needs in society to deliver social value. In the alternative view, the stakeholder view, the shareholders are seen as just one of the stakeholders in the business, alongside the customers, employees, and the local community in which the firm operates. And so firms need to balance those interests rather than prioritising one group. We saw that shareholder perspective was championed by Milton Friedman, whilst the stakeholder model grew out of work by Freeman and others. In the shareholder model, firms focus on maximising economic value, whilst in the stakeholder model, firms deliver both economic and social value. Now, whilst that debate has been long running, in recent times, the shareholder view has come under attack for a variety of reasons, including well-publicised scandals and misdemeanours by various companies, and also through the criticisms of governments, activists and the media increasingly highlighting the flaws of companies and holding them account. At the same time, consumers, investors and staff are increasingly conscious of a wider set of decision criteria when they are buying the company's products, investing in its stock, or choosing to work for that organisation. It is increasingly seen that a short-term focus onto shareholder value is undermining that rationale for the stakeholder model, i.e. by firms focusing on what they do, it creates the wealth that other institutions use to deal with society's problems. For some, the criticisms go far deeper, believing there is a flaw in the very assumptions on which the shareholder model is based. They would argue that in its approach, it encourages a denatured view of the environment. The world around us is separate and exploitable in our quest for wealth. An argument that the modern capitalist approach has a focus onto consumption to drive volumes through production at the expense of everything else. Also a focus onto financial risk rather than a wider set of risks that society may be facing. And also a human-centric view of the world that separates us from the rest of nature, causing us to act in ways that don't value that wider ecology. Even Michael Porter would agree with some of these criticisms. Here he is, making this very point.
And the broader question of what should be the role of corporations in economic and social development. This question now has reached the level of urgency for business. We are right now at a time where there are many, many challenges facing the world. And what has been so striking to me is how the awareness of these challenges has grown to a level that I have never experienced before. Business has often been seen as part of the problem in these challenges. And indeed, the legitimacy of business today is the lowest that I have ever experienced in my professional career.
Many companies have become trapped in an outdated approach to value creation, narrowly focusing on short-term financial performance. Now, those criticisms have led to support for the shareholder model to wane, with an increasing belief that firms should focus on their impact onto society. So look at how they're destroying and generating social value. We see firms encouraged to look at their impact across, say, the UN Sustainability Development Goals, and also to measure their performance against a wider set of metrics rather than just their financial performance. So looking at their performance in regards to people and to the planet, the so-called triple bottom line. And a major mechanism for making this contribution is seen as corporate social responsibility, CSR. Now, there is no widely agreed definition of what corporate social responsibility is. Here is just one by the Bronfman Commission. What is common to those definitions? CSR is the voluntary practice of companies who are integrating social and environmental concerns into their business operations. So it's a voluntary practice by firms, not mandated by governments in rules, regulations and laws. However, over the last couple of decades, there's been growing criticisms of the impact that such corporate social responsibility activity has had. The plethora of uncoordinated CSR and philanthropic activities, seemingly neither making a meaningful social impact, nor indeed strengthening the firm's long-term competitiveness. Many would say that this is down to the fact that in many organisations, CSR approaches appear to pit economic against social value, rather than seeing them going hand in hand. And so often, it's just seen as cost, or simply a marketing campaign aimed to protect the firm's reputation and ability to trade. And from that, we see glossy CSR reports like the ones here from Associated British Food, Yokohama, and even oil companies like Chevron. Another criticism is that those choices made in CSR initiatives are simply an area where managers are personally interested in, rather than linking through into the competencies and expertise of the firm. Even some of the architects of some of the models being used, like Elkington, who coined the phrase of the triple bottom line in a recent Harvard Business Review article, feels it hasn't changed anything. So the results of current approaches to CSR have often been cosmetic, reactive, and certainly fragmentary. Here again is Michael Porter making this point, and also starting to talk about the solution to this that he and his fellow author, Michel Kramer, propose.
What we're doing now isn't working. We haven't solved the problems of society, and it hasn't benefited us as businesses. If you look really, really hard at impact and ask ourselves, how many corporate CSR programs, initiatives actually really move the needle in a way that's really noticeable and measurable, in the community or in any particular dimension of social impact, we have very few examples where that could be kind of confidently asserted. I think fundamentally the problem is that still the vast majority of activity in this area is actually seen as separate from the business. I firmly believe that now we have to raise the bar. What we're talking about here is a way of reconceiving how we do business to actually create a positive benefit for society at the same time as we're creating economic value. So what's the notion of creating shared value? Corporate policies and practices that enhance the competitiveness of the company while simultaneously advancing economic and social conditions in the communities in which the company operates. If we take the notion of CSR, and if we take this notion of creating shared value, which we'll abbreviate as CSV, how do we kind of compare and contrast the two? CSR is an area where agendas are often heavily externally determined. There's a variety of pressure points on the business, on the firm, and we have to respond to those pressure points. CSV is something that has to be company specific. Because if you're going to create shared value, there has to be the shared part, therefore there has to be the connection to you. And therefore, this is an area that requires intense and deep understanding of the business, of the value chain, of the product, of the customers that you can or do serve. CSR is kind of separate from profit maximization. CSV is integral to profit maximization. In CSR, the impact you can have is limited to your CSR budget. CSV is about mobilizing the entire budget of the corporation to impact social issues. That, I believe, is the only way to restore the legitimacy of the corporation.
So what Porter is saying here is there is a way in which we can harness the strengths of firms to make a real difference in many of the problems that society is facing. But in doing that, a far more structured, a far more strategic approach is needed to those activities. And in that, calling for firms to focus in areas where they do have the competence, and so they will have the most impact and be able to sustain that activity. So rather than seeing social value separate from economic value, Porter and Kramer call on firms to look for the intersection points where activity generates both economic and social value. So it delivers shared value. And in that, mirroring a long-term theme of Porter's work, calling on firms to focus. So make choices to pursue a small number of initiatives where they can bring their full strength to bear. Now, to help managers in identifying those intersection points, Porter and Kramer offer their corporate shared value matrix. This is simply a categorization device. You could liken it to 3 buckets in which you categorize the social issues and actions the firm is considering. We start in the middle bucket, those issues that the value chain impacts. So in the day-to-day, everyday activities of the business, it is impacting on social value. So this is an inside-out impact that the firm is having. In the second right-hand bucket, we're looking at the broader social dimensions of the firm's competitive context. These are social issues that will greatly affect the firm's marketplace and its future competitiveness. So these are outside-in impacts. So things that your macro analysis, through your pest or pestle, the areas that are going to be of major consequence for the firm's future. If issues do not fit into either of those 2 buckets, they go into the third left-hand one. And these are generic social impacts. And these are social issues that are not significantly affected by the company's operations, nor materially affect its long-term competitiveness. Now, in this, Porter and Kramer split the matrix into 2 halves. To the left, they describe social initiatives as being responsive CSR. So in this space, only social value is being generated and the firm is just incurring a cost. And right hand side is strategic CSR. And these are areas where the firm is generating both social value and economic value through their activities. So shared value is being generated. And the different areas then suggest the actions the firm should take about each area. If an issue falls into the social dimension of the competitive context, then the firm should be being proactive. It should be looking to leverage its capabilities to improve those areas of the competitive context. Where it is a value chain impact and it's having a positive impact in delivering the firm's strategy and delivering economic value, the firm should be investing in those issues. Where there is a value chain impact, where the firm's activities in its value chain are having a negative impact onto social value, the firm should mitigate that harm, even though it will incur a cost. And finally, in generic social impacts, while the issues here may be important to society, the firm is not equipped with the competencies and expertise to have a significant and sustained impact. And therefore it is better for society that the firm diverts resources to focus onto strategic CSR, which can bring to bear its full strengths. So what Porter and Kramer are saying here is that firms need to make choices about where they deploy the resources they possess, directing them to that strategic CSR area where they're generating both economic and social value, and pulling back on areas where they are just being responsive and have little to offer in solving those societal issues. So invest into strategic CSR, fix those negative impacts from the value chain, and stop or simply comply where there are generic social impacts. Now, the categorization of social issues will vary by different industries and companies. If you think about AIDS in Africa, a major concern, and for a company like Anglo-American with large interests in Africa, it directly impacts its workforce and potential future workforce. So for that company, this issue would be in the social dimension for the competitive context. While for GlaxoSmithKline, this would go more to the value chain category. It can deploy its value chain to create social value and potentially generate economic value. Whilst for a company like Walmart, perhaps in the US, this would be seen as a generic social impact. Walmart may well be able to generate more social value by directing its resources to other social issues. Another societal issue, pollution and emissions. Well, for Toyota and other car manufacturers, controls on emissions will be a key part of their future competitiveness. So this issue very much needs to go into the social dimensions of the competitive context category. While for Walmart, with its large distribution and trucking activities, and for Netflix with its large server centres, this issue links more to activities in their value chain. And either how do they reduce the negative impact, possibly in the process gaining economic value. Walmart looking at alternative energy sources in the cabs of their trucks, finding not only do they reduce emissions, but also they save costs in the process. And then for a financial services company like American Express, this issue would fit more into the generic social impacts. Yes, turning the lights off at night in your offices is a must, but resources may well be better off invested elsewhere. We can say the same thing for child obesity. For fast food chains like McDonald's, a major future strategic issue. While for foods and drinks companies like Coca-Cola and Nestle, directly linked to their value chains. While for an oil company like Shell or a photocopier and optics company like Canon, this issue would go in the generic social impacts. Now in all this, I hope it's clear that Porter and Kramer are not saying that firms should not engage in generating social value. They are saying that focusing in areas where the firms have the capabilities to make a real difference is more in the interest of society than taking a broad brush approach that has been CSR in the past. Now, the Porter and Kramer approach does appeal to many practitioners and scholars. It promotes social issues to a strategic level, and by the involvement of Michael Porter, effectively puts this issue into the boardroom and to the executive teams of major organisations. However, there are criticisms of this approach and the underlying assumptions. Critics claim it ignores the deep-seated tensions between social and economic goals. There may be some low-hanging fruit where you can generate shared value, but that's only a small part of what firms do. There's also a claim that it is naive about the challenge of business compliance, and also that it's a shallow conception of the firm's role in society. Now those criticisms are what we'll explore in the next video in this study unit. See you then.